Now, as we know, the International Criminal Court has brought its credibility into disrepute after it requested arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister. This essentially conflated the democratic government of Israel, defined by its morals and how it acts in accordance with international law. Well, it equated them with the Hamas terrorists. One journalist who, since October 7, has been a standout in his exceptional columns writing about this issue, Israel, anti-Semitism, and just pulling apart the hypocrisy, is the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, the most experienced political journalist in our country. Paul, I'm delighted to have you join me once again. Thank you very much for your time. It's always an honour to have you here. Why do you think the International Criminal Court got it so badly wrong in its decision?
I think there's been a lack of integrity, a lack of credibility, and a sense of bias against Israel long displayed from this court. And as far as Australia is concerned, if the prosecutor's request to issue these arrest warrants is given, I think Australia should consider very carefully whether it wants to remain a member of this court. We know that the previous Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, who is essentially responsible for us joining the court, has signalled that as far as he's concerned, he thinks we should withdraw if these arrest warrants are given. I think John Howard, if they are given, will make a very powerful statement. But the point about this court is, this court with this decision brings into doubt its own credibility. Australia, as a democratic sovereign nation, is under no commitment to adhere to this court if we feel it lacks proper standards. So I think there'll be a real test here if these warrants are in fact granted.
What we saw, part of its flawed process, which meant that it arrived at this decision, is that it reportedly, and this is according to very credible reports in the Times, it reportedly relied on a panel that was far from impartial. It was stacked with ideologues who hate Israel, and they relied on advice of doctors that were Hamas sympathisers.
Look, I think there are three essential problems with this statement from the prosecutor. The first is, what it means is that leaders of democratic nations that are attacked, that seek to defend themselves in a war campaign and eliminate their aggressor, are likely to be charged with war crimes. Well, if this court had been around in 1944 and 1945, then I think Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman would have been up as war criminals. Secondly, by linking Hamas with the Israeli leaders, essentially you create a sense of equivalence there. This is very damaging to Israel. It's linked with a terrorist organisation, and it elevates Hamas almost to the status of a nation state. I think, it indicates the flawed nature and the biased nature of the culture of the court. And finally, the provisions of the court are that in a last resort, it can only intervene in a particular country where the judicial system of that country is not working or is non-existent. That does not seem to apply in the case of Israel. So for those reasons, and given those arguments, I think we've got to look very, very suspiciously at the motives and the purpose of this prosecutor's decision. And what will be fundamental, of course, is what the panel on the court decides about the arrest warrants.
Yeah, and not to mention they didn't even visit Israel. They didn't even go on the ground like they had said they were meant to. So they didn't follow their own processes for a thorough investigation. Paul, those were very strong remarks, very, very well said. What do you make of the Albanese government's response to this finding? We saw that other parts of the world, many of our international counterparts led by the United States, strongly condemned the ICC decision, the ICC ruling. And yet our own leadership in Australia couldn't say that if Benjamin Netanyahu came here, hypothetically, that he wouldn't be arrested.
Well, they're weak and they're paralysed. They seem to be spooked. And I think the government is spooked about how to manage the internal politics of this conflict within this country. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we have the President of the United States making a powerful statement saying this is an outrageous statement from the prosecutor, we have the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom criticising it, and we have the Prime Minister of Australia can't defend it and can't criticise it. He just can't talk about it. It's as though he's immobilised. Well, that won't work, because at the end of the day, if the court decides to issue the warrants, then Australia, as a committed nation to the court, will be obliged to arrest the Israeli Prime Minister if he visits this country again, as he did back in 2017 when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister. Now, of course, that won't happen. I'm quite certain that if the warrant is upheld, no Australian government will take that action. But the fact of the matter is, being committed to the court means that we should take that action. Well, how untenable is that? How untenable would it be for an Australian government to be in a situation where it was obliged to arrest the Prime Minister of Israel, or the former Prime Minister of Israel?
Should he step forward here?
Precisely.
Unbelievable. Just one final question. You know, you mentioned how the Prime Minister is immobilised and he can't seem to utter any strong words on this issue, and it has been a problem for him over the past 8 months. Do you think this goes to his character? Is he just a different type of leader than others we've seen in the past, other Prime Ministers in the past, or is it on this particular issue that he seems to be caught in the politics of it?
I think this is a particularly difficult moral and political issue for the Labor Party. We haven't seen this sort of issue erupt before at this level, on this scale, for a Labor government. And what's happened, of course, over the past 20 to 25 years within the Labor Party, particularly the left of the Labor Party, hostility to Israel has become virtually an article of faith. Now, a lot of people weren't aware of that. We're only aware of it to a certain extent as a result of what's happened with the war. So there's a fundamental internal problem for the Labor Party managing its own ranks, given the degree of hostility towards Israel within the party. Then you've got the related problem of the votes in a number of Labor electorates where there is a high percentage of Muslim voters, and the party and senior members of the party are particularly concerned about that. That is a political and electoral problem for them. You put those two problems together and essentially you've got a government which I think has been weak and uncertain and all over the place, bending one way, bending the other way over the course of the past 8 months. It doesn't reflect well on the character of the Prime Minister.
Indeed, indeed. Doesn't reflect well on the character of Albanese. It certainly doesn't. Paul Kelly, thank you so much for being in here and for being so strong and articulate in your articles in The Australian and here tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sharon.